Jerusalem, 1229. A man walks alone through the church of the Holy Sepulchre. No army behind him, no blood on his hands, no bishop waiting to greet him. In fact, the bishop has locked every church in the city rather than welcome him inside. The Patriarch of Jerusalem would sooner shut down God's house than celebrate this man's arrival. And yet here he is, in the holiest city on earth, having done what 200 years of war could not do. He will place a crown on his own head in a few hours, because no one will do it for him. His name is Frederick, and we will come back to him. But first, we need to go back 134 years before this moment, to a field in southern France, to a pope who is about to say something that will change the world.
To a crowd that will respond with 3 words that echo across 8 centuries, to the moment it all began. This is not a story about religion against religion. This is not a story about the Christian West against the Muslim East, a clean clash of civilizations, with heroes on one side and villains on the other. This is not a story that belongs safely in the past, filed away under medieval and forgotten. This is a story about what happens when genuine faith gets tangled up with raw power, when the cross becomes a battle standard, when the words "God wills it" are spoken by a pope and repeated by a mob, and carved into the justification for things that cannot be undone. This is a story about 200 years of holy war, about massacres and mercy, about children who never came home,
about a Christian army that burned a Christian city, about a Muslim sultan who showed more grace than the men who came to fight him. And it is a story about what was left behind in the wreckage, because something was left behind, something the world still lives with today. Stay with me. The year is 1095. The place is Clermont, in the Auvergne region of what is now France. It is November, cold, gray, the kind of day that makes the indoors feel like safety. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd of bishops, nobles, and common people gathered in a field outside the city walls. The church inside could not hold them all. He is a French-born pope, polished, politically shrewd, deeply aware that the Christian world he leads is fracturing.
The feudal knights of Europe are fighting each other constantly, bleeding the continent dry with private wars. The Eastern Roman Emperor, the Byzantine ruler in Constantinople, has sent an urgent letter begging for military help against the Seljuk Turks pressing in from the east. And Jerusalem, the city where Christ walked, was crucified, was buried, is under Muslim rule. Urban sees an opportunity. He begins to speak. We do not know exactly what he said. This is one of history's most remarkable silences, the most consequential sermon of the medieval age, and not one verbatim transcript survives. We have 4 different accounts written by 4 different chroniclers, and they do not fully agree. What we know is the shape of it, the emotion of it.
He described the suffering of Christians in the East. He described Jerusalem, the city of God, in the hands of those he called enemies of the faith. He called the knights of Europe, men trained for violence, men with nowhere to point it, to take that violence east. He promised that those who died on this journey would receive forgiveness of their sins, a full indulgence, heaven essentially guaranteed. And the crowd, thousands of people standing in a cold French field, erupted with 3 words, Deus vult, God wills it. They said it over and over, Deus vult, Deus vult. And Urban II, watching the wave of it move through the crowd,
must have felt something enormous had been set in motion. He was right. He had no idea how right he was. What followed was not one war. It was 9 major crusades and dozens of smaller ones, spanning almost 200 years, from 1095 to 1291. They would reach from the cold cathedrals of France to the sun-bleached walls of Jerusalem. They would involve kings and peasants, children and emperors, saints and war criminals, sometimes the same person. They would produce some of the darkest moments in the history of the Christian Church, and they would leave behind a legacy, complicated, unexpected, real, that still shapes the world you live in today. We are going to look at all of it: the crimes, the mercy, the carnage, the knowledge, the children who were sold into slavery, and the one man who walked into Jerusalem without drawing his sword. Frederick is still waiting for us. But first, the mob. The mob came first. Before the knights put on their armor, before the banners were sewn, before any organized army marched east under the cross, a man named Peter set out on foot from northeastern France with a crowd behind him that grew and grew until it was 40,000 people deep. Peter the Hermit, that is what history calls him. A small man, reportedly, with a long face and a gray donkey he rode everywhere. Charismatic in the way that only truly unhinged conviction can make a person charismatic. He had supposedly made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem before urban sermon, had seen the suffering of Christians there with his own eyes, and when the Pope's call came, Peter was already burning. He preached in towns and villages across France and Germany. People sold their homes.
Farmers left their fields mid-season. Women brought their children. Old men who could barely walk joined the column. They believed, genuinely believed, that God would part the way before them, that the sheer force of their faith would carry them to Jerusalem. They called themselves the People's Crusade. What happened instead should have been the first warning. It was not. The column moved east through the Rhineland, through the Jewish communities of Mainz, Worms, Speyer, and Cologne. And here, before the People's Crusade had even left Europe, before they had encountered a single Muslim soldier, before they had come within 1,000 miles of Jerusalem, they committed their first massacre. The Jews of the Rhineland had nothing to do with Jerusalem. They were merchants, craftsmen, scholars, people who had lived in these German cities for generations, under the protection of bishops and local lords. Some of those bishops tried to hide them. Some locked them inside cathedral compounds. It was not enough. The Crusaders broke through. The reasoning, if you can call it that, was simple and savage. Why travel all the way to the Holy Land to fight the enemies of Christ when the enemies of Christ are right here? Thousands died. In Mainz alone, entire communities were wiped out. Some Jews chose to take their own lives rather than be killed or forced into baptism. The chronicles record mothers holding their children. You do not need me to say more than that. The bishops protested. Rome was horrified. Peter the Hermit himself apparently tried to stop some of it. None of it stopped. This is the first chapter of the Crusades. Not a battle, not a siege, a pogrom in Germany, against people who had no army, no fortress, no part in the fight. The People's Crusade pressed on into Hungary, into Bulgaria, leaving a trail of theft and violence behind it, attacking Christian communities along the way because they ran out of supplies and simply took what they needed. By the time they reached Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Alyokos, the man who had asked for help, looked at this ragged, violent, starving mob and made a swift decision.
He shipped them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as fast as he could. The Seljuk Turks were waiting.
At a place called Civitat, the Turkish army annihilated the People's Crusade. Most of the 40,000 were killed or captured. Peter the Hermit survived. He had gone back to Constantinople on an errand. He would later join the main Crusader army and make it to Jerusalem. The children who had followed him from France and Germany did not. The real army came months later. Knights, trained fighters, tens of thousands of them, organized into 4 separate columns under lords like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond IV of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto. These were men who knew how to fight, and they fought their way across Anatolia in brutal stages, through heat and starvation and disease, losing thousands along the way. It took them 3 years.
3 years of marching, sieging, dying, fighting among themselves, watching their horses starve and their friends fall to fever. By the time the First Crusade reached the walls of Jerusalem in June of 1099, the army that had left Europe was a fraction of its original size. Gaunt, exhausted, burning with something that 3 years of suffering had only made more intense. They believed they were on the edge of the holiest moment of their lives. On the 15th of July, 1099, they broke through Jerusalem's walls. What happened next is documented. It is not disputed. The debate among historians is about scale, about exactly how many, exactly how far it spread, but the fact of it is not in question. A massacre. The Crusaders moved through the city, killing.
Muslims who had taken refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque were killed there. Jewish residents who had gathered in their synagogue, the synagogue was burned. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers, who was there, who walked through Jerusalem after it was over, wrote that blood soaked the ground of the Temple Mount. For 3 days the killing continued. And then, and this is the part that stops you, Godfrey of Bouillon walked to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to pray. Godfrey, the man who, when offered the title King of Jerusalem, refused it. His exact words vary by account, but the meaning is consistent. He would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns. He was, by every account left to us, a man of genuine, deep, sincere faith.
He walked through the carnage to pray. This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is something harder to sit with than hypocrisy. It is a man who genuinely loved God, who genuinely believed he was doing God's work, walking through the consequences of that belief and not seeing the contradiction, or seeing it and having no framework to process it. The First Crusade was over. Jerusalem was taken. And somewhere in the rubble of what had just happened, in the blood drying on the stones of a city 3 faiths tall holy, the question had already been asked, even if no one was ready to hear it yet. Is this what God willed? Let's stop here for a moment. We are not even halfway through. We have seen a pope ignite a movement with a sermon no one wrote down correctly. We have seen 40,000 people, farmers, mothers, children, follow a man on a donkey toward a city they would never reach. We have seen Jewish communities massacred in Germany before the Crusade left Europe. We have seen Jerusalem taken, and what taking it cost. And we have 192 more years to go. There are 8 more Crusades, a Christian army that will burn a Christian city, a sultan who will show more mercy than the men who came to fight him, a boy preacher who will lead thousands of children to the sea and lose them, and one excommunicated emperor who will walk into Jerusalem without drawing his sword and get further than any of them. If you want to see how this ends and what it left behind, stay with me. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. This channel covers the full story of church history, the faith, the failures, the things nobody talks about. Hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. One more thing before we continue. Tell me in the comments, did you learn about the Crusades in school? What were you told? Because I have a feeling a lot of us got a very partial picture, and I want to know which part surprised you most so far. All right, back to Jerusalem, 98 years after the massacre. A Kurdish general is riding towards the city, and he is about to do something no one expected. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History remembers him as Saladin. He was Kurdish, born in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq, in 1137.
He had united the fractured Muslim world of the Middle East under his leadership through a combination of military genius, political shrewdness, and a personal code of conduct that his own enemies could not stop admiring. He was, by the accounts of both Muslim and Christian chroniclers, a man who meant what he said. And what he said in 1187 was that Jerusalem was coming back. The Crusader kingdom that had held Jerusalem for nearly a century was fracturing from within. Bad leadership, internal feuds, a king dying of leprosy, Baldwin IV, the Leper King, one of the most tragic and genuinely heroic figures of the entire era, who fought Saladin from horseback while his body failed him. And after Baldwin died, the kingdom made a catastrophic decision. They picked a fight with Saladin they could not win. At a place called the Horns of Hattin, a volcanic ridge above the Sea of Galilee, in July, in the brutal heat of a Levantine summer, Saladin trapped the main Crusader army. He cut off their water. He set the dry grass around them on fire. And then he waited. The Crusader army, thirsty and choking on smoke, fell apart. It was over in a single day. The kingdom of Jerusalem lost its army, its king, and the true cross, the relic they carried into battle, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross of Christ. All at Hattin, Saladin captured it. The shock that rippled through Christian Europe when the news arrived was unlike anything since the First Crusade had been called. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief when he heard. Jerusalem fell 3 months later. Saladin's army surrounded the city. The defenders, outnumbered and leaderless, knew they could not hold. And here is where history turns in a direction no one expected. Saladin negotiated. He set a ransom for each inhabitant, a fee to leave safely. For those who could not pay, he allowed wealthy crusaders to ransom the poor in bulk. His own brother Saladin went to Saladin and asked for 1,000 poor Christians as a gift. Saladin gave them to him, and Saladin freed them on the spot. Saladin then gave another 700 himself. The Christian civilians left Jerusalem alive. No massacre, no churches burned. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christendom, was left standing. Muslim and Christian holy sites alike were protected. Contrast this with 1099. 88 years earlier, the Crusaders had taken this same city and killed until the streets ran with blood. Now, the man taking it back, the Muslim sultan they had been told was the enemy of God, let them walk out. The medieval Christian world did not know what to do with this. It did not fit the story they had been telling themselves. Dante Alighieri, the greatest poet of medieval Christendom, a devout Catholic writing in the early 1300s, placed Saladin in limbo in his Divine Comedy. Not in hell, not among the damned. In limbo,
the place reserved for virtuous souls who lived before Christ or outside the church, but whose lives reflected a goodness that could not simply be discarded. A Muslim warrior, in the afterlife of a 14th century Catholic poem. That single detail tells you more about what Saladin's mercy meant to the world than any history book summary can. But the Crusades did not end with Saladin. Europe responded, of course it did. The Third Crusade came roaring out of the West, led by three of the most powerful kings in Europe: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, the Lionheart. Frederick Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia before he reached the Holy Land. His army largely went home. Philip II quarreled with Richard and went home early. Richard stayed. And Richard was extraordinary, a military commander of genuine genius, relentless, physically fearless, the kind of leader men would follow into fire. At the siege of Acre, he fought through a severe fever, directing assaults from a litter because he was too sick to stand. Acre fell. It was a significant victory. And then came the 15th of August, 1191. Negotiations with Saladin over the prisoner exchange had broken down. The details are disputed by historians. Who broke the agreement first, whether Saladin delayed, whether Richard warned him. What is not disputed is what happened next. Richard ordered the execution of his prisoners. 2,700 men, Muslim soldiers captured at Acre, marched to a hill outside the city walls, a place called Iadea, in full view of Saladin's army watching from a distance, and killed. Saladin's army moved forward. Too late. Richard I the Lionheart, the hero of 1,000 English ballads, the king whose statue stands outside the Houses of Parliament in London to this day, ordered one of the largest single massacres of prisoners in the entire crusading era. He then continued his campaign, fought Saladin to a standstill, came within sight of Jerusalem, close enough that, according to one chronicle, Richard raised his shield to block his own view of the city because he did not believe he could take it and did not want to see what he could not have. He never entered Jerusalem. Instead, he negotiated the Treaty of Jaffa, 1192. Christian pilgrims would be allowed safe access to Jerusalem. The city would remain under Muslim control. Richard and Saladin never met in person, but they exchanged gifts and messages of mutual respect throughout the campaign. The man who massacred 2,700 prisoners, making peace with the man who watched it happen. The Crusades were like this, constantly like this. Stay with me, because it gets stranger. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land at all. It started in 1202, launched by Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes in history, a man who genuinely believed he was going to finally reclaim Jerusalem for good. The Crusaders gathered in Venice, needing ships. The Venetians agreed to provide them, for a price, and when the Crusaders could not pay in full, the Venetians proposed an alternative. There was a city on the Adriatic coast, Zara, that Venice wanted reclaimed from Hungary. Christian city, Catholic city. Help us take it, said the Venetians, and we will call the debt even. The Crusaders sacked Zara. Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire army. They kept going. Then came Constantinople. The details of how a crusade aimed at Jerusalem ended up attacking the greatest Christian city in the world are complicated, involving a displaced Byzantine prince, broken promises, and the particular moral flexibility that seems to emerge when an army is far from home and running out of money. But the result is simple. In April of 1204,
The Crusader army sacked Constantinople. They burned the city. They melted down gold Byzantine crosses and church ornaments into coins. They stole relics, the crown of thorns, fragments of the true cross, bones of apostles, and shipped them back to Western European churches, where many remain to this day. They destroyed or scattered the great library collections of the Byzantine world. Manuscripts that had survived 1,000 years, gone. They installed a Latin emperor on the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire. Pope Innocent III, who had launched this crusade, who had excommunicated this army, who had tried to stop this, wrote afterward that the Crusaders had committed outrages that even the Saracens would have blushed to commit. He wrote this in a formal letter about his own Crusaders.
The split between Eastern and Western Christianity, already cracked since the Great Schism of 1054, deepened into something that has never fully healed. The Eastern Orthodox churches remember 1204. They have not forgotten. And neither should we. But of all the horrors that came out of the crusading era, there is one that history struggles to even categorize, because it involves children. The year is 1212. A boy, perhaps 12 years old, perhaps younger, stands in a field in the Rhineland and begins to preach. His name, according to the chronicles, is Nicholas of Cologne. He tells the people around him that God has spoken to him, that a new crusade is coming, not of knights and swords, but of the innocent.
That an army of children, pure in heart, will march to the Mediterranean, and the sea will part before them, as it parted for Moses, and they will walk to Jerusalem in peace, and the Muslims will see their innocence and convert, and the Holy Land will be restored without a drop of blood. Thousands of children follow him, from Germany, from France. Estimates range from 10,000 to 30,000, though historians debate the numbers. Boys and girls, some teenagers, some far younger, walking south through the summer heat, through the Alps, toward the sea. The sea did not part.
When the children who survived the march reached Marseille, two merchants, their names recorded as Hugh Furius and William Porcus, names that deserve to be remembered for the right reasons, offered to provide ships, free of charge, out of devotion to God, they said. They sailed not to the Holy Land, but to North Africa, where the children were sold, into slavery. Most never returned. A few accounts suggest some ended up in Egypt, in Baghdad, scattered across the Islamic world as servants and slaves. One chronicle says that of all who left, 7 boys made it back to Germany, years later, broken and silent about what had happened to them. Nicholas of Cologne is not mentioned again in any reliable source.
The Children's Crusade is the moment you stand in front of history and feel something go quiet inside you. Because this is not an army. This is not a political calculation gone wrong. This is children who believed, who trusted, who followed a voice that told them God would protect them, and were sold. This is what the crusading ideal had become by 1212. This is what 2 generations of holy war had built, a world where a boy could preach in a field and thousands of children would follow him to their destruction, because the idea of the crusade had been so deeply planted in the European imagination that even the innocent believed it was theirs to join. There is no redemption in this story. There is only the sea that did not part, and the silence of 7 boys who came home.
We go back to the man in the church. Jerusalem, February 1229. He walks through the church of the Holy Sepulchre alone. No procession, no blessing, no bishop beside him.
Because the Patriarch of Jerusalem has placed the entire city under interdict rather than welcome this man inside. No church services, no sacraments, no bells. The holiest city in Christendom, locked down by its own church leadership in protest of his arrival. He is used to it. His name is Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany, Italy, Sicily, and Jerusalem, though that last title is about to become real in a way no one expected. He is 34 years old. He speaks 6 languages: Latin, Italian, French, German, Greek, and Arabic. He keeps Muslim scholars at his court in Palermo.
He corresponds with Arab mathematicians and astronomers as intellectual equals. He has been excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX, twice. He is, depending on who you ask, either the most sophisticated ruler in Europe or the most dangerous man alive. He has come to the Holy Land with a small army and no papal blessing, no indulgence promised to his soldiers, no Deus Vult ringing in their ears. Just Frederick, curious, calculating, genuinely fascinated by the culture he has been told is his enemy, arriving at the edge of a conflict that has been running for 130 years. He does not draw his sword. He sits down. The man across the table is Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt, Saladin's nephew.
A ruler who has his own political pressures, rivals within the Muslim world, a fractured coalition, threats from other directions. Al-Kamil has actually reached out to Frederick before, has suggested in diplomatic correspondence that some kind of arrangement might be possible. Frederick has been listening. They talk. Not through intermediaries, not through translators working down a long chain of diplomatic formality. Frederick speaks Arabic. He sits with Al-Kamil, and they discuss, by the accounts of chroniclers on both sides, philosophy, mathematics, the nature of God, the movement of stars. Frederick reportedly asks Al-Kamil questions about Islamic theology with the genuine curiosity of a man who wants to understand, not defeat. And then they negotiate. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in February of 1229. Christian control of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth restored. A corridor to the coast secured. Muslim access to the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock preserved and guaranteed. A 10-year truce. No blood, no siege, no army broken on a field in the summer heat. Frederick had done in 6 months of conversation what the First, Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Crusades combined, with their hundreds of thousands of soldiers and their rivers of blood, had failed to do or failed to hold. He walks to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There is no bishop to crown him. The Patriarch has locked the churches, so Frederick picks up the crown of Jerusalem from the altar and places it on his own head. No fanfare, no blessing.
Just a man, a crown, and the quiet of a church in a city that should have been celebrating. This is not the story the Crusades were supposed to tell. This is not the ending anyone on either side had planned for. This is not what Deus Vult was supposed to look like, an excommunicated emperor placing his own crown on his own head in a silent church after a peace treaty with a Muslim sultan. And yet here it is. Frederick left Jerusalem after a few days. The Crusader lords of the Holy Land, furious at his diplomacy, furious at the concessions made to Al-Kamil, furious that he had succeeded where they had failed, pelted him with offal in the streets of Acre as he boarded his ship to leave. He sailed home, dealt with the Pope, continued ruling, continued his intellectual correspondence with Arab scholars. The treaty held for 15 years, not because armies enforced it,
because two men had sat at a table and found, beneath the centuries of war and theology and grievance, something they could both agree on. It collapsed in 1244, not because diplomacy failed, but because neither side's hardliners would let it live. Khwarezmian forces, hired by a rival sultan, retook Jerusalem, this time for good. The Crusaders would never hold it again. And here is the part of this story that history does not always tell. Because the Crusades did not only leave blood behind, they left something else, something quieter, something that took generations to show itself, but that you are living with today, whether you know it or not.
In the Crusader-held cities of the Levant, in Antioch, in Acre, in the courts of Sicily and Toledo, where East met West, something was happening underneath the warfare, a transfer. Islamic scholars had spent centuries preserving, translating, and expanding upon the works of ancient Greece, Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, texts that had vanished from Western Europe after the fall of Rome, existing now only in Arabic translation, annotated and extended by Muslim mathematicians and physicians and philosophers. Through the contact zones opened by the Crusades, through trade, through captured manuscripts, through scholars who sat in the same rooms and argued about the same questions, those texts began flowing back into Europe. Aristotle came back to the West through Arabic translation.
The mathematics of al-Khwarizmi, algebra, the very word coming from his book title, entered European universities. Medical knowledge developed in the Islamic world, including the works of Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, became the foundation of Western medicine for 3 centuries. The pointed arch, a defining feature of Gothic cathedral architecture, the soaring spires of Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, was borrowed from Islamic building design, transmitted through Crusader contact with the architecture of the Levant. The Renaissance does not happen on the timeline it does without this transfer. The scientific revolution does not happen on the timeline it does with the mathematics and astronomy that came through these contact zones.
This is not a justification for the massacres. It cannot be. The children sold into slavery in North Africa did not give their lives for the Renaissance. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland did not die so that Europe could rediscover Aristotle. History does not work that way. It does not balance accounts, does not trade atrocity for achievement. But this is what complexity looks like in real life. War opened routes. Routes carried knowledge. Knowledge built a world. And the world that was built on that knowledge also had to reckon, eventually, painfully, incompletely, with what the war had cost. The Knights Hospitaller built field hospitals in Jerusalem. Founded originally in 1080, before the First Crusade even arrived, expanded and systematized under Crusader rule into the first organized military medical corps in Western history, trained physicians, funded wards, treated soldiers and civilians, Christian and Muslim alike. Their model echoes forward through history into the military medical traditions of modern armies, into the Geneva Conventions, into the Red Cross, whose founder, Henry Dunant, explicitly invoked the Hospitaller tradition when he established it in 1863. A thread running from the blood-soaked stones of Jerusalem in 1099 to the Red Cross on a white field that marks field hospitals in every conflict on earth today.
Saladin's conduct at Jerusalem in 1187 became a reference point in medieval European literature on chivalry, a Muslim sultan setting the standard that Christian knights were supposed to aspire to. Even the men who fought him could not stop writing about him with admiration. And Frederick II, excommunicated, pelted with garbage, crowned by no one, showed something that every century since has had to relearn at enormous cost. that the enemy across the table is also a human being, that beneath the centuries of theology and grievance and war, there are interests that can be negotiated, problems that can be solved without killing, questions that can be asked with genuine curiosity rather than a sword. Frederick learned it in 1229. The world is still learning it.
The Crusades ended in 1291, when the last Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre, fell to the Mamluk Sultan. The last Crusaders sailed away from the shores of the Holy Land. Some wept, some did not look back. 200 years, 9 major crusades, hundreds of thousands dead, soldiers, civilians, Jews massacred in Germany, children sold in North Africa, citizens burned in Constantinople, a Christian army that sacked a Christian city, a Muslim sultan who showed more grace than the men sent to fight him, an excommunicated emperor who came closest of all to peace, and a legacy, dark and rich and complicated and real, that the world is still sorting through. So, here we are. 1291. The last ship leaving Acre.
The last Crusaders on the shore of a land they spent 200 years trying to hold and losing. What do we do with all of this? I want to give you 3 things to take with you, not conclusions. History this complicated does not have clean conclusions, but 3 things that are true, that I think matter. The first is this: the Crusades were not one thing. They were 9 major campaigns and dozens of smaller ones, spanning nearly 2 centuries, launched by a mix of genuine faith and naked ambition and political calculation and economic greed. Sometimes all 4 in the same man, in the same month, in the same decision. The people who went were not all cynical opportunists, and they were not all sincere saints.
They were human beings caught inside an idea that was bigger than any of them could fully see or control. The massacre at Jerusalem in 1099 was real. The mercy of Saladin in 1187 was real. The children who never came home were real. The manuscripts that came back to Europe and built the foundations of the Renaissance were real. All of it is real. All of it happened. History does not give us the luxury of choosing only the parts that are comfortable. The second is this: if your faith has ever been used to justify harm, or if you have ever watched faith be used that way, the Crusades are the clearest mirror history has to offer. This is not an argument against faith. Urban II believed. Godfrey of Bouillon believed. The children who followed Nicholas of Cologne to the sea believed. Belief is not the problem. The problem is what happens when belief stops asking questions. When God wills it becomes a sentence that ends the conversation rather than beginning one. When the certainty of divine purpose is handed to men with armies and debts and land they want to control, and no one in the room is allowed to ask, "Are we sure?" Frederick II asked. He was excommunicated for it. Saladin asked, or at least acted as though he had, and a Muslim sultan became the moral standard that Christian Europe measured itself against for 200 years. The question is not whether faith is real. The question is whether we are honest enough, humble enough, to let it be questioned, to hold it carefully, to notice when it is being used as a weapon by people who need a weapon and have found one ready to hand. That question did not end in 1291. It is still being asked. And the third. Frederick II walked into Jerusalem without drawing his sword. He sat down with the man he was supposed to fight. He learned his language. He asked him questions. He found, under centuries of war and theology and grievance, a problem that could be solved, and he solved it. And they pelted him with garbage when he left, and the Pope called it a scandal, and history almost forgot him. Almost, because the treaty held 15 years of peace in a city that had known almost nothing but war for 2 centuries. Not because God intervened dramatically from the sky, not because one side finally defeated the other,
but because 2 men sat at a table and decided that the human being across from them was worth talking to. Frederick was wrong about many things. He was not a saint. He was complicated in the way that powerful people are always complicated, capable of cruelty, capable of brilliance, capable of seeing something clearly that the people around him refused to see. But he saw this. And what he saw is the oldest and most stubborn lesson in human history, the one we learn and forget and learn again, at a cost that should by now be unthinkable. That the person across the table is a person. That conversation is not surrender.
That peace, real peace, not the temporary silence between 2 exhausted armies, requires sitting down with someone you have been taught to hate and finding out what they actually need. It is not a complicated idea. It is just a very hard one. Before I go, tell me in the comments, which part of this story surprised you most? The crimes, the legacy, Frederick, Saladin? What landed differently than you expected? I read every comment. I want to know. And if this video gave you something to think about, share it. Not because of the algorithm, because this story deserves more people in the room. The Crusades ended in 1291. But the questions they raised about faith, about power, about what we are willing to do in the name of God, and what we are willing to build in the name of peace, those questions did not sail away with the last ship from Acre. They are still here, and how we answer them still matters.